My name is Sydney. At 28 years old, I stood alone at the altar of a historic Atlanta church surrounded by 500 elite guests, waiting for a groom who never showed up. My future mother-in-law projected a message on the church screens stating their legacy could not lower its standards for a poor art appraiser like me. While the congregation gasped, my own sister snatched the bridal tiara from my head, and her white husband threw a $200,000 venue bill right in my face. I simply smiled and reached into my dress. They had no idea that the woman they were humiliating was actually the secret owner of the wealth management fund holding the deed to their entire generational estate. Before I share how I dismantled two arrogant families in one day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned a public humiliation into the ultimate power move. The heavy oak doors of the church remained firmly shut. 2 hours had passed since the ceremony was supposed to begin. 500 of Atlanta elite residents shifted uncomfortably in the wooden pews. The groom side of the church was conspicuously empty. There was no Xavier. There were no groomsmen. None of his extended relatives who usually paraded their generational wealth at every social gathering were present. I stood at the altar in a custom silk gown, feeling the collective weight of 1,000 eyes burning into my back. The silence in the sanctuary was deafening, broken only by the sharp whispers of guests speculating about my humiliation. My father Elijah stood a few feet away, with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He had built a massive logistics empire from a single delivery truck, but the old money families in this room still looked down on him as uncultured. I could see the anger radiating from his rigid posture as he watched his daughter being left at the altar. Suddenly, the massive projection screens above the choir loft blinked to life. These screens were normally reserved for hymns and scripture verses. Instead, a text message from Beatrice, my future mother-in-law, appeared in massive black letters for the entire congregation to read. The message was brief and brutal. It read that their family legacy could not lower its standards to welcome a working-class outsider. It stated Xavier had left the city, and they apologized to their true peers for this inconvenience. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous church. The sheer cruelty of broadcasting my abandonment on a massive screen was a calculated move designed to destroy my reputation permanently. They did not just want to cancel the wedding. They wanted to ensure I could never show my face in this city again. Before my father could step forward, my older sister Olivia marched up the altar steps. I expected her to pull me into a hug or shield me from the staring crowd. Instead, she reached out and violently yanked the vintage diamond tiara from my hair. The metal pins tore at my scalp, but Olivia did not care. She held the sparkling heirloom away from me with a look of pure disgust. "I told you this would happen, Sydney," Olivia said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent church. "This heirloom jewelry is meant for true Atlanta royalty. It is not meant for a struggling art appraiser who spends her days dusting off old paintings for a meager paycheck. You should have known Xavier would wake up and realize you do not belong in his world." "You are my sister," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the stinging pain in my scalp. I told her she was standing in front of 500 people tearing me down while my groom was missing. "Someone has to tell you the truth," Olivia shot back, gripping the tiara tightly. "She told me I always thought I was so special, hiding out in my little appraisal office, refusing to play the social game. She said I embarrassed them, and the circles her husband and her had worked so hard to enter. She claimed our dad might indulge my delusions because he does not know any better, but the real elites see right through me. She called me a commoner trying to play dress-up." Right on cue, her husband Spencer strode up the altar steps to join her. Spencer was the director of investment at the family firm owned by Xavier. He frequently used his position and his white privilege to assert dominance over anyone he deemed inferior, which included my father and me. He walked with an arrogant swagger, a thick manila envelope gripped in his right hand. He stopped inches from my face and slapped the envelope against my chest. It hit me with a heavy thud and fell to the marble floor, spilling its contents. Since your groom realized you are a terrible investment, someone has to cover the damages, Spencer sneered, looking down at me. He pointed out the final invoice for the Ritz-Carlton catering, the floral arrangements, and the church fees. $200,000, Sydney. He told me the vendors were waiting in the lobby right now and ordered me to pick it up and pay them. He loudly suggested my credit card was going to decline again, like it did when I tried to buy his dinner back in college. The guests in the front pews murmured at the mention of my supposed financial struggles. Spencer smiled, a slow, creeping grin of deep satisfaction. He loved reminding me of a minor banking error from 10 years ago, using it as permanent proof of my inferiority. He thrived on humiliating my father and his hard-earned money, while worshipping the generational wealth of his employers. "Pick up the bill!" Sidney Spencer ordered, his voice dripping with condescension. He told me I wanted to play in the big leagues, and this is what it costs. He told me to call my bank and beg them for an overdraft, so everyone could see what happens when a blue-collar girl tries to trap a high-society man. I looked down at the invoices scattered across the marble floor. I looked at Olivia clutching the tiara she had stolen from my head. I looked at Spencer standing there with his chest puffed out, believing he had just delivered the final crushing blow to my dignity. They wanted me to break down crying. They expected me to run out the side doors in shame and beg my father to clean up the mess. Instead, I slowly bent down and picked up the envelope. I smoothed out the crumpled invoices and looked directly into Spencer and his pale eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble. I just smiled. My name is Sydney. At 28 years old, I stood alone at the altar of a historic Atlanta church surrounded by 500 elite guests, waiting for a groom who never showed up. My future mother-in-law projected a message on the church screens stating their legacy could not lower its standards for a poor art appraiser like me. While the congregation gasped, my own sister snatched the bridal tiara from my head, and her white husband threw a $200,000 venue bill right in my face. I simply smiled and reached into my dress. They had no idea that the woman they were humiliating was actually the secret owner of the wealth management fund holding the deed to their entire generational estate. Before I share how I dismantled two arrogant families in one day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever turned a public humiliation into the ultimate power move. The heavy oak doors of the church remained firmly shut. 2 hours had passed since the ceremony was supposed to begin. 500 of Atlanta elite residents shifted uncomfortably in the wooden pews. The groom's side of the church was conspicuously empty. There was no Xavier. There were no groomsmen. None of his extended relatives who usually paraded their generational wealth at every social gathering were present. I stood at the altar in a custom silk gown, feeling the collective weight of 1,000 eyes burning into my back. The silence in the sanctuary was deafening, broken only by the sharp whispers of guests speculating about my humiliation. My father, Elijah, stood a few feet away with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He had built a massive logistics empire from a single delivery truck, but the old money families in this room still looked down on him as uncultured. I could see the anger radiating from his rigid posture as he watched his daughter being left at the altar. Suddenly, the massive projection screens above the choir loft blinked to life. Instead, a text message from Beatrice, my future mother-in-law, appeared in massive black letters for the entire congregation to read. The message was brief and brutal. It read that their family legacy could not lower its standards to welcome a working-class outsider. It stated Xavier had left the city. The sheer cruelty of broadcasting my abandonment on a massive screen was a calculated move designed to destroy my reputation permanently. They wanted to ensure I could never show my face in this city again. Before my father could step forward, my older sister Olivia marched up the altar steps. Instead, she reached out and violently yanked the vintage diamond tiara from my hair. The metal pins tore at my scalp, but Olivia did not care. She held the sparkling heirloom away from me with a look of pure disgust. "I told you this would happen, Sydney," Olivia said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent church. "This heirloom jewelry is meant for true Atlanta royalty. It is not meant for a struggling art appraiser who spends her days dusting off old paintings for a meager paycheck. You are my sister, I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the stinging pain in my scalp. I reminded her we were in front of 500 people while my groom was missing. Someone has to tell you the truth, Olivia shot back, gripping the tiara tightly. She said I embarrassed them in the circles her husband and her had worked so hard to enter. She claimed our dad might indulge my delusions because he does not know any better, but the real elites see right through me. She called me a commoner trying to play dress-up. Right on cue, her husband Spencer strode up the altar steps to join her. Spencer was the director of investment at the family firm owned by Xavier. He walked with an arrogant swagger, a thick manila envelope gripped in his right hand. He stopped inches from my face and slapped the envelope against my chest. It hit me with a heavy thud and fell to the marble floor, spilling its contents. Since your groom realized you are a terrible investment, someone has to cover the damages, Spencer sneered, looking down at me. He pointed out the final invoice for the Ritz-Carlton catering, the floral arrangements, and the church fees. $200,000, Sydney. He told me the vendors were waiting in the lobby right now and ordered me to pick it up and pay them. He loudly suggested my credit card was going to decline again like it did when I tried to buy his dinner back in college. The guests in the front pews murmured at the mention of my supposed financial struggles. Spencer smiled a slow, creeping grin of deep satisfaction. "Pick up the bill," Sidney Spencer ordered, his voice dripping with condescension. "He told me I wanted to play in the big leagues, and this is what it costs." He told me to call my bank and beg them for an overdraft so everyone could see what happens when a blue-collar girl tries to trap a high society man. I looked down at the invoices scattered across the marble floor. I looked at Olivia, clutching the tiara she had stolen from my head. I looked at Spencer standing there with his chest puffed out, believing he had just delivered the final crushing blow to my dignity. They wanted me to break down crying. They expected me to run out the side doors in shame and beg my father to clean up the mess. Instead, I slowly bent down and picked up the envelope. I smoothed out the crumpled invoices and looked directly into Spencer and his cold, pale eyes. I did not shed a single tear. I did not tremble. I just stood back up and smiled. A collective gasp rippled through the historic sanctuary. The wealthy guests who had been whispering cruel jokes just moments ago were now completely silent. Spencer froze in his tracks. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, leaving behind a mask of pure panic. The color drained from his cheeks as his pale eyes widened in absolute terror. He took a menacing step toward me, his fists balled so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. He let out a harsh curse that echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the church, demanding to know what I was talking about. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice deadly calm. I told him he should be much more careful with his expensive electronics. Last night, while he and Olivia were busy drinking vintage champagne and bragging to the entire family about their upcoming European vacation, he left his laptop unlocked on the kitchen island. I explained that I was simply looking for a spreadsheet for the wedding caterer, but what I found was far more interesting. I spoke loudly enough for the first few rows to hear every single word. I told him I saw the hidden offshore accounts. I saw the shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. I detailed exactly how I watched him systematically siphon millions of dollars from the family investment portfolio owned by Xavier and his parents. Spencer took another step forward, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to formulate a lie to save himself. He stammered and pointed his trembling finger at my face, claiming I was a crazy woman making up desperate stories because my groom had left me. But the raw panic in his voice betrayed him completely. The elite guests in the front pews, many of whom had their own money tied up in that exact investment firm, began to murmur anxiously to one another. I did not back down for a single second. I smiled and informed Spencer that I had already forwarded the entire digital trail of his massive embezzlement to my father and his legal team. I told him the money he just used to pay for this ruined wedding was merely a tiny fraction of what he had stolen to maintain his lavish lifestyle. I looked out at the congregation and announced that the brilliant financial mind of Spencer was nothing but a cheap fraud funded entirely by stolen black wealth. Before Spencer could say another pathetic word, a blur of white silk rushed up the altar steps. It was my older sister, Olivia. Her face was contorted with a toxic mixture of profound denial and explosive rage. She simply could not handle the idea that her perfect life and her perfect husband were built on a criminal lie. She absolutely refused to accept that the sister she had always looked down upon was the one holding the match that would burn her fake kingdom to the ground. Olivia raised her hand high and brought it down across my cheek with a resounding crack. The sharp, violent sound of the slap echoed through the massive, empty spaces of the church. My head snapped to the side from the sheer, unexpected force of the blow. The congregation erupted into loud, shocked gasps. My father, Elijah, immediately lunged forward with a furious roar, ready to pull Olivia away from me and protect his youngest child. I held up my hand firmly and stopped him in his tracks. I slowly turned my face back to look directly at my sister. The skin on my cheek burned with intense heat, but I absolutely refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing me shed a single tear. Olivia stood over me, breathing heavily with her eyes blazing with irrational hatred. She pointed a manicured finger at my face and screamed at the top of her lungs, "You are a liar, Sydney. You are just making up sick stories to ruin my beautiful life because yours is so pathetic." She shouted that I was nothing but a bitter, jealous failure who could never measure up. Then she delivered the ultimate insult designed to completely break my spirit. "You are just jealous because I managed to secure a rich white husband who treats me like a queen, and you got dumped at the altar by a prime black man." Her hateful words hung in the air, heavy with internalized racism and desperate classism. She actually believed that her proximity to whiteness and stolen wealth made her fundamentally superior to her own flesh and blood. She genuinely believed Xavier leaving me was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my utter worthlessness. I stood there silently absorbing the sheer toxicity of her statement. I looked at her with nothing but pure pity. I was just about to tell her that a common thief for a husband was no prize at all when a sudden sharp sound interrupted the heavy silence. It was my cell phone. A loud chime echoed from the small hidden pocket sewn inside the seams of my wedding dress. In a room so quiet you could hear a pin drop, that simple digital sound felt like a cannon blast. I slowly reached into my gown and pulled out my device. The screen was lit up with an urgent message from my best friend Maya, who was supposed to be a bridesmaid but had called out sick with a severe stomach bug yesterday morning. The notification clearly indicated she had sent a live video link. I quickly swiped the bright screen. Maya wrote she was incredibly sorry, and I needed to see this immediately. I tapped the link. The live video showed a luxury resort in the Bahamas. Standing beneath a floral arch was Xavier, smiling joyously. He was secretly marrying the daughter of a ruthless real estate billionaire at this very moment. My heart stopped as I stared at the unmistakable evidence of his ultimate betrayal unfolding in real time, right before my very eyes. The heavy oak doors of the church closed behind us, sealing away the murmurs of the elite crowd. The cool evening air hit my face, but the burning sensation of Olivia's slap and the sickening reality of that live video still consumed my mind. Xavier was married. My groom, the man who had whispered promises of our future just 24 hours ago, was currently sliding a ring onto the finger of a real estate heiress on a sun-drenched beach in the Bahamas. My father guided me to his waiting car, his large hand resting protectively on my shoulder. We rode in complete silence toward the house I had spent the last year turning into a home. It was a beautiful modern colonial in one of Atlanta's most exclusive gated communities. I had poured my entire savings into the down payment, a gesture of my commitment to our future, while Xavier promised to handle the mortgage. I just wanted to go home, pack my bags, and disappear for a while to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. But the cruelty of Xavier's family knew no bounds. As my father's car turned onto my street, my stomach completely dropped. The pristine green lawn of my property was littered with trash bags, cardboard boxes, and loose items. As we pulled closer, I realized it was not trash. It was my life. My designer clothes were strewn across the damp grass. My expensive appraisal tools, magnifying loupes, specialized UV lights, and rare art reference books were tossed carelessly into the dirt. A pair of my favorite heels sat submerged in a muddy puddle near the sprinkler system. Standing on the expansive front porch, flanked by two massive private security guards, was Beatrice. My former future mother-in-law wore a pristine cream-colored pantsuit, holding a glass of iced tea as if she were hosting a casual summer garden party. Her face twisted into a grotesque smile of absolute triumph as I stepped out of my father's car, my wedding dress dragging heavily across the pavement. "What is the meaning of this?" "Beatrice," I demanded, my voice trembling with a mixture of profound exhaustion and rising anger. I told her she had absolutely no right to touch my belongings or trespass on my property. Beatrice let out a high-pitched theatrical laugh that grated against my ears. "Your property," she sneered, taking a slow sip of her tea. She stepped forward to the edge of the porch, looking down at me as if I were an insect that had crawled onto her immaculate driveway. "You really are as naive as my son claimed you were, Sydney. You see, this house is legally deeded entirely in Xavier's name. You are nothing but an unwanted squatter who overstayed her welcome." I felt a cold wave of panic wash over my chest. I told her I paid the $200,000 down payment from my own personal bank account. I reminded her I had the wire transfer receipts to prove it. Beatrice simply waved her manicured hand dismissively, signaling one of her security guards. The guard walked down the steps and shoved a legal document into my chest. It was an eviction notice along with a signed affidavit. Beatrice explained with wicked delight that legally my contribution was classified as a romantic gift to her son. There was no cohabitation agreement and no ring on my finger to prove otherwise. She said Xavier's new father-in-law, the billionaire real estate developer, had his legal team draft the eviction paperwork the moment Xavier boarded his private jet to the Bahamas. "You do not belong in this neighborhood," Beatrice declared, her voice turning cold and vicious. She told me to gather my pathetic little art tools and go back to whatever cramped apartment I crawled out of. She said her new daughter-in-law would be redecorating the master bedroom by the end of the week, and they needed the trash cleared out immediately. Tears of sheer frustration and helplessness burned at the corners of my eyes. I had lost my groom, my dignity, and now the very home I had poured my life savings into. I bent down to pick up one of my scattered art history books, brushing the dirt from its cover, feeling entirely defeated. That was when my father stepped forward. Elijah did not yell. He did not curse. He moved with the quiet, dangerous stillness of a man who had fought his way up from the bottom and knew exactly how to handle bullies. He walked right up to the edge of the security line, forcing the two massive guards to step back defensively. "You are going to regret touching my daughter's things, Beatrice," my father said, his voice a low rumble that commanded absolute authority. Beatrice scoffed, rolling her eyes. She looked my father up and down, taking in his simple, tailored suit and mocking the invisible blue collar past she knew he carried. "Are you going to deliver a package to my door, Elijah?" she mocked. She told him that just because he managed to turn a few delivery trucks into a company does not mean he understands how real wealth operates. She claimed his new money was loud and classless, just like his daughter. She said in their world, pedigree matters, and a truck driver playing corporate executive would never be a match for a family with a century of old money heritage. She laughed and told my father to pack my things into one of his moving vans and drive us back to the slums. The sheer venom in her classist insults was designed to break us down, to make us feel utterly inferior. I felt a hot tear finally slip down my cheek. I reached out and gently grabbed my father's arm, telling him we should just leave because they were not worth it. I just wanted to escape the humiliation. Elijah turned to me and gently wiped the tear from my cheek. His rough, calloused thumb, a testament to decades of hard, honest work, was the most comforting thing I had ever felt. He smiled and his eyes held a profound, terrifying calmness. "It is okay, baby," my father said, his voice projecting clearly, so Beatrice and her guards could hear every single word. "You do not need to shed a single tear over this cheap piece of drywall." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy antique brass key. He held it up, letting it catch the fading evening light. "Dad has another place for you," he continued. He turned his body and pointed directly across the wide, tree-lined street. My eyes followed his pointing finger, and my breath hitched in my throat. Sitting directly across from Beatrice's modern house, positioned on a massive elevated double lot, was the historic Hawthorne Manor. It was a sprawling, majestic estate with towering columns, wrought iron gates, and perfectly manicured botanical gardens. It was the most expensive and exclusive property in the entire neighborhood, a house Beatrice had publicly coveted and tried to buy for the past 10 years. "I just closed on it this morning," my father stated casually, tossing the heavy brass key into my hand. He looked back at Beatrice, whose face had suddenly drained of all color, her smug smile replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. My father wrapped his arm around my shoulder and guided me away from the scattered boxes. "Go ahead and leave that trash on our lawn, Sydney," he said loudly. "We have a mansion to furnish." My father's arm felt like a shield of solid steel as he guided me away from the scattered debris of my former life. We left Beatrice standing on her pristine driveway, clutching her iced tea with a look of absolute horror painted across her pale face. We crossed the wide, tree-lined street, leaving the cruel insults and the eviction notice behind us in the dirt. As we approached the towering wrought iron gates of Hawthorne Manor, they swung open silently, welcoming us into a world that Beatrice had always believed belonged exclusively to her. The massive stone columns of the estate glowed under the warm security lights, and the perfectly manicured botanical gardens stretched out like a private sanctuary. I walked up the sweeping marble staircase, still wearing my ruined wedding gown but feeling lighter with every step I took. Inside, the grand foyer sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished mahogany floors. My father gave my shoulder one last comforting squeeze and told me to get settled while he made some calls to arrange for new clothes and a proper meal. I thanked him and walked down the long, echoing corridor toward the east wing of the massive house. I stopped in front of heavy double doors carved with intricate patterns. I reached behind a decorative wall sconce and pressed my thumb against a hidden biometric scanner. A soft click echoed through the silent hall, and the heavy doors slid open to reveal a state-of-the-art command center. This was not the office of a struggling art appraiser who spent her days dusting off old oil paintings for a meager paycheck. The room was lined with glowing monitors displaying real-time global market data, offshore account tracking, and complex investment portfolios. I walked over to the massive glass desk and trailed my fingers across the smooth surface. For years, I had played the role of a quiet working-class girl to test the true character of the people around me. Nobody in Atlanta society knew that the quiet art appraiser they constantly mocked was actually the anonymous founder and sole owner of Apex Heritage. My wealth management fund controlled billions of dollars in assets and quietly held the financial leashes of some of the most arrogant old money families in the entire country. I sat down in the leather executive chair and took a deep breath, letting the reality of my true power settle over me. My private phone suddenly buzzed on the glass desk. The caller ID flashed with Olivia's name. I swiped the screen to answer and put the call on speakerphone, leaning back in my chair. The line immediately exploded with chaotic shouting. Spencer and Olivia were both yelling over each other, their voices pitched high with raw panic and desperate rage. Spencer demanded to know who I thought I was dealing with. He threatened me with a massive defamation lawsuit, claiming his high-powered legal team would bury me in court for daring to accuse him of embezzlement in front of Atlanta elite residents. He screamed that I had no solid proof, and that sending those files to our father was the biggest mistake of my miserable life. Olivia chimed in, her voice dripping with pure venom. She vowed to completely destroy my pathetic little appraising career. She promised to call every gallery, museum, and private collector in the state to ensure I never worked in the art world again. She yelled that I was a bitter, jealous commoner who was just trying to ruin her perfect marriage because my groom had realized I was worthless and left me for a woman with real status. I listened to their frantic threats echoing through my sophisticated command center. I did not raise my voice or offer a single defense. I simply told them that the truth does not care about defamation lawsuits and that they should spend less time yelling at me and more time packing their bags before the federal investigators knocked on their door. I calmly tapped the screen to end the call, cutting off Spencer's furious screaming mid-sentence. A moment later, my secure encrypted line chimed. It was my executive assistant Marcus calling from the Apex Heritage headquarters in London. He apologized for interrupting my evening, but stated he had urgent information regarding the primary target we had been monitoring. I told him to go ahead and report his findings. Marcus informed me that the massive real estate deal Beatrice and her family had been boasting about for the past 6 months had completely collapsed. But the situation was far worse than a simple bad investment. He reported that Beatrice had secretly leveraged her precious 150-year-old family estate to secure the initial bridge loans. Because the deal had gone under the primary lender, was initiating immediate aggressive foreclosure proceedings. Marcus paused for a moment and added the final brilliant detail. He confirmed that Apex Heritage had just silently acquired that specific debt portfolio from the bank. I smiled as I looked at the glowing screens, realizing that the very people who had just thrown my belongings onto the lawn were completely unaware that I now personally owned the deed to their precious generational legacy. Exactly 1 week later, the grand iron gates of Beatrice's beloved ancestral estate were thrown wide open. The sprawling 150-year-old property was bathed in the warm glow of thousands of string lights. Valets rushed back and forth, parking a continuous parade of imported luxury cars. It was the social event of the season, a lavish welcome gala thrown to celebrate Xavier and his new billionaire heiress bride. Inside the grand ballroom, champagne flowed like a river, and a live string quartet played softly in the corner. The room was packed with the most influential figures in the city. Among the sea of elite residents, my sister Olivia and her husband Spencer strutted around like royalty. They clinked crystal glasses with politicians and chief executive officers, acting completely oblivious to the federal investigation that was already quietly encircling Spencer's finances. Olivia wore a custom gown that probably cost more than my first car, laughing loudly and soaking in the attention of being connected to the groom's family. They all thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded me like trash and moved on to their perfect high society future. I did not wear a wedding dress this time. I wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit with a sleek leather briefcase gripped firmly in my hand. I walked up the marble steps of the grand estate, completely unbothered by the sheer opulence around me. When I reached the massive mahogany doors, the private security team immediately moved to block my path. They recognized me from the church and from the cruel eviction on my front lawn. I did not flinch. I calmly reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents stamped with the official seal of the primary lending bank. I handed the paperwork to the head of security and watched the color completely drain from his rough face. The heavy doors swung open, and I walked into the crowded ballroom. The music did not stop, but the conversations closest to me certainly did. Heads turned, and sharp whispers spread like wildfire as people recognized the jilted bride crashing the prestigious welcome gala. I ignored the staring eyes and pulled a digital appraisal tablet from my briefcase. I walked straight toward a display of antique silver serving trays and began meticulously logging their serial numbers and estimated auction values. It only took 3 minutes for Beatrice to spot me. She was standing near the towering champagne pyramid, wearing a ridiculous feathered fascinator. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, her jaw dropped in absolute shock. She stormed across the ballroom, her heels clicking furiously against the polished marble floor. She demanded to know how I had gotten past security and shrieked that I was a psychotic stalker who could not accept that her son had traded up for a better life. She waved her arms frantically, calling for the guards to drag me out by my hair and throw me into the street where I belonged. I did not stop typing on my tablet. I simply pulled a laminated lanyard from my pocket and let it hang around my neck. I looked Beatrice dead in the eye and told her I was not there as a guest. I informed her that I was the official bank-appointed appraiser. I explained in a voice just loud enough for her wealthy friends to hear that since her family had defaulted on their massive bridge loans, the bank required a full pre-foreclosure evaluation of all physical assets inside the estate. I told her I was just doing my job logging her crystal chandeliers and antique Persian rugs to see exactly how much of her crushing debt they would cover at the upcoming liquidation auction. The surrounding guests gasped and instinctively took a collective step back. The whispers instantly shifted from mocking my presence to questioning Beatrice's financial stability. Before Beatrice could formulate a coherent lie to save face, the crowd parted. Xavier walked forward looking incredibly uncomfortable in his tailored tuxedo. Clinging tightly to his arm was his new wife. She was draped in heavy diamond necklaces, looking me up and down with an expression of intense amusement and deep pity. The new bride let out a delicate, condescending laugh. She told me it was honestly tragic that I had to resort to taking low-level bank jobs just to catch a glimpse of the life I almost had. She patted Xavier's arm and declared that her father, the real estate billionaire, had already promised to handle any silly little debt issues Xavier's family might have. She leaned in close, reeking of expensive floral perfume, and whispered that a working-class girl like me should really learn when she has been permanently outclassed. She pointed her manicured finger toward the centerpiece of the ballroom. It was a massive oil painting hanging above the grand fireplace. The bride proudly announced that it was her dowry gift to the family, a rare 17th-century European masterpiece valued at over $2 million. She bragged that it was purchased by her father from an exclusive private art dealer in Geneva, and that it alone was worth more than my entire miserable existence. I slowly walked over to the grand fireplace, completely ignoring her insults. I pulled a specialized ultraviolet appraisal light from my briefcase and clicked it on. I shined the bright purple beam across the canvas, tracing the intricate brushstrokes and the faded signature in the bottom right corner. I turned off the light and placed it back into my briefcase with a soft click. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting to see my reaction. I looked directly into the new bride's arrogant eyes and smiled a razor-sharp smile. I asked her if she had kept the receipt from that exclusive dealer in Geneva. I raised my voice so it carried clearly to the very back of the silent room. "New bride," I said calmly, "did you know your $2 million dowry painting is a fake?" The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. Every single guest stared at me, waiting for the punchline of a joke they desperately hoped I was telling. The string quartet had completely stopped playing their instruments, leaving a heavy, suffocating stillness in the massive space. The new bride let out a nervous, breathless laugh, her heavy diamond necklaces glittering harshly under the crystal chandeliers. She told me I was out of my mind, and that her billionaire father only employed the absolute top art authenticators in all of Europe. I did not flinch or back away from her arrogant glare. I walked closer to the massive canvas, depicting a dramatic, stormy ocean scene, and pointed directly to the vibrant white crests of the painted waves. I explained that a true, authentic 17th-century masterpiece would have been painted using a traditional lead white pigment. I told the wealthy crowd that lead white naturally degrades and shifts tone over centuries, taking on a dull yellowish hue. I stated clearly that the bright, pristine white on this specific canvas was undeniable titanium white. I announced that titanium white was not invented or commercially used in oil paintings until the 1920s, making it physically impossible for this item to be a 300-year-old antique. Beatrice pushed her way to the front of the gathering crowd, her face flushed bright red with a toxic mixture of blinding rage and sheer panic. She demanded that I shut my mouth immediately and stop humiliating her family in front of their most esteemed guests. I reached into my leather briefcase again and pulled out a small, specialized magnifying loupe. I handed the tool directly to a prominent, wealthy art collector standing in the front row, whom I easily recognized from various high-end charity auctions around Atlanta. I politely invited him to step forward and examine the canvas texture for himself. I told him to look very closely at the craquelure, which is the fine network of cracks that naturally forms on genuine aged oil paintings. The older man placed the magnifying loupe over his right eye and leaned intimately close to the painted surface. He let out a sharp gasp and stepped back instantly, as if the canvas had burned him. He announced to the completely silent room that the cracks were far too uniform and completely superficial. He stated loudly that the cracking pattern had been artificially baked into the top layer of modern varnish to mimic hundreds of years of natural aging. He looked directly at Beatrice and slowly shook his head, confirming to everyone that the $2 million dowry gift was completely worthless. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and utterly brutal. The polite upper-class whispers erupted into a deafening roar of vicious gossip and harsh judgment. The elite guests who had been practically bowing to Beatrice and the new bride just moments ago were now openly mocking them behind their champagne flutes. They realized that the wealthy real estate billionaire had either been completely conned himself or had intentionally gifted a worthless fake painting just to secure his daughter a coveted spot in this high society family. The new bride turned beet red and covered her face with her trembling hands, bursting into loud, dramatic tears of pure public humiliation. Beatrice grabbed at her chest, looking as if she might actually pass out right there on the polished marble floor. Her perfect, flawless welcome gala had turned into a spectacular public disaster in a matter of minutes. I stood perfectly still, watching the arrogant facade of this fake family completely disintegrate before my very eyes. Before I could pack my appraisal tools back into my leather briefcase, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my left wrist. It was Xavier. His handsome face was entirely drained of color and slick with a layer of nervous sweat. He did not say a single comforting word to his sobbing new wife or his hyperventilating mother. Instead, he yanked me aggressively away from the judging crowd, dragging me down a dark, secluded hallway near the rear servant quarters. He pushed me into a small, dimly lit alcove and stood blocking my only exit with his broad shoulders. His chest heaved as he looked down at me with wild, desperate eyes. He looked nothing like the confident prime black man who had strutted through life believing his good looks and family name meant he owned the entire world. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut on his leg. Xavier suddenly dropped his aggressive posture and fell heavily to his knees right there on the dusty hardwood floor. He reached out and grabbed both of my hands, begging me to lower my voice and keep quiet. He pleaded with me to stop dismantling his fragile life piece by piece. He told me I had absolutely no idea what was actually going on behind closed doors. He confessed in a frantic whisper that his family was completely bankrupt and currently drowning in massive, unpayable debts. He admitted that the bank was actively threatening to take everything they owned, including the very historic estate we were standing in right now. He looked up at me with tears welling in his dark eyes, playing the role of the tragic, helpless victim perfectly. He claimed he never actually wanted to leave me standing alone at the church altar. He swore on his life that his mother Beatrice had aggressively forced him to marry the real estate heiress, just to secure the financial bailout they so desperately needed to survive the month. He squeezed my hands tighter and whispered that he still loved me deeply and thought about me every single day. He told me the crying new bride meant absolutely nothing to him, and that this lavish marriage was strictly a miserable business transaction to save his parents from complete social and financial ruin. He begged me to just let them have this one fake victory so he could secure the dowry money and pay off their aggressive creditors. He promised with absolute sincerity that once the family debts were completely cleared, he would divorce the foolish heiress and come crawling back to me so we could finally build our beautiful life together. He asked me to be the bigger person and walk away tonight without exposing any more of their devastating secrets to the public. He actually believed I was still the naive, sweet girl who would happily sacrifice her own dignity and self-respect just to protect a man who had publicly humiliated and destroyed her. I stared down at the man I almost married, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, icy disgust. The sheer cowardice of his desperate confession was incredibly pathetic to witness. He was entirely willing to use a completely oblivious woman for her family money, while simultaneously stringing me along as his convenient secret backup plan. He had absolutely no integrity and no honor left in his soul. He was just a hollow, fragile shell of a man terrified of losing his precious, unearned social status. I slowly pulled my hands out of his sweaty, desperate grip and took a deliberate step back away from him. I did not scream at him or slap his face like his sister had done to me. I simply looked down at him kneeling in the shadows like a common beggar and told him his brilliant business transaction was already failing because his new father-in-law was just as fake as the cheap oil painting hanging in the ballroom. Xavier stared up at me in total blank confusion, completely failing to comprehend the magnitude of my final warning. What he did not know was that my personal phone was tucked safely inside the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit, with the voice recorder application actively running the entire time. I had successfully captured every single pathetic word of his desperate confession in high-definition audio. I had recorded him freely admitting his family was entirely bankrupt, admitting his new marriage was a fraudulent financial scam, and admitting he planned to divorce his new bride the very moment he secured her funds. I turned my back on Xavier and walked away, leaving him kneeling alone in the dark, narrow hallway. I pulled my phone from my pocket and stopped the recording. I did not march back into the ballroom to play the audio for the gossiping crowd. That would be far too easy and entirely too brief. Instead, I opened my encrypted messaging application and attached the crystal-clear audio file. I selected Spencer as the direct recipient, knowing the corrupt investment director was already sweating bullets over the massive embezzlement files I held over his head. I hit send and typed a single simple text message beneath the audio file. I wrote, "What is your next move?" I stood in the dim hallway watching the delivery confirmation light up on my phone screen. Within 30 seconds, the little typing bubble appeared next to Spencer's name. It hovered there for a long moment before disappearing entirely. He had nothing to say. I knew exactly what was happening in his mind. Spencer was standing in that opulent ballroom surrounded by fake wealth and listening to the pathetic, whining voice of his brother-in-law completely unraveling their entire charade. I turned my phone on silent, slipped it back into my suit jacket, and walked out the servant exit into the cool night air, leaving the Hawthorne Gala to its inevitable public collapse. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent warfare. Marcus, my executive assistant back in London, kept a close eye on the digital footprints of Spencer's banking firm. Spencer did not reply to my message, but his swift actions spoke volumes. He was absolutely furious at Xavier for being so incredibly weak and handing me the exact ammunition I needed to destroy them both. Spencer knew that if Xavier cracked under pressure, the federal investigators would have a direct map to the offshore accounts where Spencer had been funneling the embezzled funds. Spencer realized he could not intimidate me directly anymore because I held the audio file and I clearly had the resources to tear down Beatrice's estate. So he decided to aim for what he believed was my weakest link. He went after my father. Elijah Wilson had built his logistics company from a single delivery truck into a regional powerhouse through 30 years of backbreaking honest work. Spencer, with his pristine suits and generational arrogance, assumed that a blue-collar man like my father must be swimming in corporate debt just to keep his massive fleet of trucks on the road. Spencer used his high-level executive privileges at the primary commercial bank in Atlanta to flag my father's company accounts for suspicious activity. He initiated an immediate and total freeze on every single line of credit, corporate card, and operational account tied to my father's name. It was a dirty, underhanded trick designed to instantly paralyze a working-class business and force the owner to their knees. Spencer thought he could starve my father into submission and force me to hand over the recordings to save my family from immediate bankruptcy. I was sitting in my command center at Hawthorne Manor, reviewing the latest foreclosure documents when the proximity alarm chimed softly. I glanced at the high-definition security monitors and saw a sleek silver sports car pulling up to the front iron gates. Olivia stepped out wearing oversized designer sunglasses and a beige cashmere coat, looking like a tragic heroine from a cheap soap opera. I buzzed her in and walked out to the grand foyer to meet her. As soon as Olivia stepped through the double mahogany doors, she ripped off her sunglasses and launched into a theatrical performance that belonged on a stage. Her eyes were red and she was forcing wet tears down her perfectly powdered cheeks. She ran toward me, acting as if we were suddenly best friends who had not spent the past year at each other's throats. "Sydney, you have to stop this right now!" Olivia cried, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. She grabbed my arm and looked at me with wide, pleading eyes. She told me that Spencer was absolutely furious about the audio file I sent him, and that I had pushed him way too far this time. She claimed she was just trying to protect me and our family from total destruction. She sniffled loudly, wiping a fake tear from her jaw. She told me that Spencer had used his executive banking connections to freeze all of Dad's operational credit accounts this morning. She said the logistics company was completely paralyzed because the fuel cards were declining and that Dad was going to lose everything he had built over the last 30 years because of my petty vendetta against her new family. Olivia tightened her grip on my arm and leaned in close, trying to look like a desperate, concerned sister. She begged me to just be reasonable for once in my life. She urged me to delete the recording of Xavier and to call Spencer right now to offer a formal apology for threatening him. She promised that if I just showed a little bit of respect and backed down, Spencer would graciously lift the freeze and let my father keep his little trucking business running. She said I was acting like a jealous child, and that destroying our father's legacy just to get back at her and Xavier was incredibly selfish and cruel. I stood there in the echoing foyer of my massive mansion, looking at the woman who had spent months treating me like dirt on her shoe. I looked at her fake tears and her desperate attempt to manipulate my deep love for my father. I slowly reached up and removed her manicured hand from my arm, brushing my sleeve as if she had left a permanent stain on the fabric. I did not yell or act frantic. I just looked at her and let out a genuine, relaxed laugh that bounced off the crystal chandeliers above us. Olivia stumbled back a step, her fake tears instantly vanishing, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. She demanded to know what was so funny about our father losing his entire life savings and having his trucks repossessed. I smiled and crossed my arms over my chest. I told her she and Spencer fundamentally misunderstood how real wealth worked because they had spent their entire lives desperately spending other people's money to look rich. I explained that Spencer's little stunt with the credit freeze was the most useless, pathetic gesture he could have possibly made. I took a slow step toward her, watching her eyes widen in sudden fear as my calm demeanor shattered her illusion of control. "Do you think Dad survived 30 years in business on credit cards?" I asked her, my voice dropping to a low, steady calm. I told her that our father absolutely despised debt and had operated his entire logistics empire strictly on liquid capital for the last 2 decades. I leaned in so close I could smell the sharp scent of her nervous sweat cutting through her expensive perfume. "Dad does not owe the bank, Olivia," I said clearly. "The bank owes Dad." Olivia just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She was completely unable to process the devastating reality that her husband had just made a fatal miscalculation. I did not give her time to formulate another fake tear or offer another pathetic excuse. I simply gestured toward the massive front doors and told her she could see herself out. I spent the rest of the evening in my command center coordinating with my father and setting the perfect trap for Spencer. The next morning, the Atlanta sky was a crisp, clear blue. I rode in the passenger seat of my father's heavy-duty pickup truck, heading straight toward the downtown financial district. We pulled up to the towering glass skyscraper that housed Spencer's elite banking branch. We walked through the pristine revolving doors, ignoring the confused stares of the tailored security guards who judged my father's simple work boots and denim jacket. We did not stop at the front desk or ask for permission. We took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. Spencer was currently marching down the opposite hallway holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee and wearing his usual arrogant smirk. He had just received an urgent summons to the managing director's office. He walked through the heavy glass doors, fully expecting to see my father begging on his knees for a miserable credit extension. He was ready to gloat and demand my complete surrender. Instead, the sight that greeted him made his arrogant smile vanish and caused him to drop his coffee directly onto the expensive imported rug. The managing director, a balding man named Harrison, was sweating profusely and standing nervously in the corner of his own office. Sitting comfortably behind the massive mahogany desk in the plush leather VIP executive chair was my father. I stood right beside him, holding my sleek leather briefcase and smiling a very cold, very predatory smile. Spencer stuttered, trying to formulate a sentence, but his brain completely short-circuited. He demanded to know what a simple truck driver was doing sitting behind the director's desk. Harrison practically lunged forward, grabbing Spencer by the lapels of his tailored suit. The director screamed that Spencer was a complete idiot who had just single-handedly destroyed their entire branch. Harrison explained in a frantic, high-pitched voice that Elijah Wilson was not a standard credit liability. He revealed that my father's logistics empire used this specific branch as their primary holding vault for decades of accumulated liquid capital. By freezing my father's operational accounts based on a petty personal vendetta, Spencer had violated strict banking regulations and deeply insulted their most valuable private client. My father leaned forward, resting his large, calloused hands on the polished mahogany desk. He did not yell or lose his temper. He spoke with the quiet, terrifying authority of a man who held the absolute high ground. He told Harrison that trust was the only currency that actually mattered in business. He stated that since the bank allowed a low-level executive like Spencer to weaponize his accounts, he was completely severing their financial relationship effective immediately. My father calmly instructed Harrison to close every single corporate and personal account under the Wilson name. He demanded the immediate withdrawal of his total operational liquidity. He wanted $50 million executed through direct offshore wire transfers and a massive physical cash cashier check before noon. The blood instantly drained from Spencer's face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He knew exactly what a sudden $50 million withdrawal meant for a localized commercial branch. It was a catastrophic liquidity crisis. The massive sudden deficit would instantly destroy their quarterly metrics tank, their regional standing, and absolutely trigger a severe federal regulatory audit. The bank simply did not have that kind of money sitting idle to cover the sudden massive gap. Harrison turned on Spencer with pure, unadulterated venom. The director told Spencer to pack his desk and surrender his security badge immediately. He threatened to not only terminate Spencer, but to blacklist him across the entire financial sector, making sure he could never work in banking again. Spencer fell to his knees, his expensive suit pants hitting the damp coffee-stained rug. He begged Harrison for just one more chance, crying real, pathetic tears and pleading for his miserable career. He promised he would fix it and begged my father to reconsider. My father did not even look at him. Harrison kicked Spencer's hands away and told him he had exactly 24 hours to magically replace the $50 million in liquid capital, or he was permanently finished and facing a massive corporate lawsuit. My father and I simply stood up, stepped over Spencer's trembling body, and walked out of the office, leaving them to choke on their own disaster. As we rode the elevator down to the lobby, I pulled out my secure tablet and activated the surveillance tap I had placed on Spencer's digital devices. I watched the screen as an intercepted outgoing call from Spencer's mobile phone connected. He was calling Beatrice, sobbing hysterically and begging his mother-in-law for absolute salvation. He told her his life was completely over and that he needed $50 million by tomorrow morning to avoid total financial ruin and a federal investigation. Beatrice's voice filtered through my encrypted audio feed, dripping with her usual arrogant confidence. She told her pathetic son-in-law to stop crying like a peasant and wipe his face. She promised she would easily fix his little problem. She boldly declared that she would simply wire the $50 million directly from her brand-new daughter-in-law's offshore trust fund without anyone even noticing to save him. I listened to Beatrice make that arrogant promise through the encrypted audio feed, and I could not help but smile at the absolute absurdity of her plan. She actually believed she could just quietly siphon $50 million from her new daughter-in-law to cover Spencer's massive banking disaster. I leaned forward in my leather executive chair and began typing rapidly on my glass keyboard. I accessed the global offshore tracking databases of Apex Heritage and ran a full financial diagnostic on the new bride and her supposedly untouchable real estate billionaire father. The search algorithms hummed through international banking records, tax filings, offshore shell companies, and private asset registries. It only took about 10 minutes for the glowing screens in my command center to reveal the hilarious and pathetic truth. The grand real estate empire of the new bride's family did not exist anymore. Her father had quietly filed for massive corporate bankruptcy nearly 4 years ago and had been living entirely on high-interest credit cards and fraudulent loans to maintain his wealthy facade. The famous offshore trust fund that Beatrice was planning to raid to save Spencer was completely empty. The account had a current balance of absolutely zero, with an overdraft warning blinking in bright red letters. I stared at the data, realizing the sheer poetic justice of the entire situation. Xavier and his arrogant mother had married this woman to save their bankrupt legacy, while the new bride and her father had married Xavier to save theirs. It was a spectacular collision of two desperate gold diggers frantically scamming each other while both were secretly drowning in mountains of unpayable debt. I closed my laptop and decided it was time to share this wonderful news with the happy new bride. My private security team tracked her location to an exclusive rooftop cafe in the city center where she was currently having a lavish lunch. I drove my father's heavy-duty pickup truck across town and walked straight up the marble steps to the private terrace. The new wife was sitting at a corner table, wearing massive designer sunglasses and sipping a sparkling pink mimosa. She was holding court with 3 other wealthy socialites, bragging loudly about her upcoming luxury honeymoons and her perfect new husband. She was waving her massive diamond ring around, catching the sunlight and soaking in the jealous stares of her friends. I pulled up a heavy wrought iron chair and sat directly across from her, completely ignoring the shocked gasps of her snobby companions. She lowered her sunglasses and glared at me with pure, absolute hatred. She demanded to know who let me up to the private terrace and told her friends I was just the bitter working-class ex-fiancé who was obsessed with her fabulous new life. I calmly placed my sleek leather briefcase on the table and folded my hands. I told her friends they might want to leave immediately because things were about to get incredibly embarrassing for their favorite fake heiress. They scattered like frightened birds, grabbing their designer bags and leaving the 2 of us completely alone at the table. I leaned in and told the new bride that she might want to check her offshore trust fund balance before her new mother-in-law tried to secretly steal $50 million from it to pay off federal investigators. I told her I knew her father was a total fraud and that her family was just as bankrupt and desperate as the family she had just scammed her way into. The color drained from her face for a brief second, before her features twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed her tall glass of iced water and threw it violently right into my face. The freezing water splashed across my tailored charcoal suit and dripped down my chin, but I did not even blink. She stood up, knocking her chair backward, and pointed a shaking manicured finger at my chest. She shrieked that I was a pathetic, jealous liar who was making up insane stories because I could not handle the reality of losing my groom to a superior woman. She placed both of her hands protectively over her flat stomach and laughed a wicked, triumphant laugh that echoed across the empty terrace. She declared that it did not matter what wild banking lies I tried to spread because she was completely untouchable now. She leaned over the table, getting right in my wet face with her eyes burning with pure malice. She told me she had the ultimate undeniable leverage over Beatrice and the rest of the miserable high society family. She proudly announced that she was already 3 months pregnant with Xavier's child. She mocked me relentlessly, saying she was carrying the elite generational bloodline that Beatrice was so obsessed with, and that they would never dare kick the mother of the future heir out onto the street regardless of her financial status. She smirked and told me she had permanently secured her place in high society by getting pregnant while I was nothing but a sad, lonely girl playing with fake bank papers. She said Xavier loved her and their unborn baby more than he ever could have loved a commoner like me. I slowly reached up and wiped the freezing water from my eyes, using a pristine white cloth napkin from the table. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of intimidation or anger. I calmly unlatched my leather briefcase and pulled out a single confidential medical document stamped by a prominent urology clinic in Atlanta. I slid the crisp white paper across the glass cafe table until it rested right beneath her trembling hands. I looked up at her triumphant, smug face and watched her eyes drop to read the bold black text on the official page. I told her it was a beautiful story about securing the elite family bloodline, but she might want to figure out who the actual father was before Beatrice found out. I smiled a cold, hard smile as her jaw dropped in absolute horror and all the color left her face. I informed her that Xavier had gotten a permanent and highly confidential vasectomy exactly 3 years ago. The fake heiress sat completely paralyzed, staring down at the medical clinic letterhead like it was a venomous snake about to strike her. Her heavily manicured hands hovered over the table, trembling violently, as the absolute destruction of her pathetic little scam washed over her. All her arrogant bragging about carrying the elite generational bloodline evaporated into the humid afternoon air. I did not wait for her to formulate another ridiculous lie or try to backtrack her way out of the corner I had just painted her into. I simply picked up my leather briefcase, adjusted my tailored charcoal suit, and walked away, leaving her to drown in the reality of her ruined charade. She honestly thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess against a wealthy family, but she was just another desperate pawn in a completely bankrupt kingdom. I drove back to the estate feeling a profound sense of icy satisfaction, but I knew the rats in this maze were getting desperate and the real war was far from over. When I arrived back at the Hawthorne property, I walked straight toward my private office and noticed the heavy oak door was pushed slightly ajar. I had deliberately left a duplicate copy of Xavier's confidential medical records sitting right on top of my mahogany desk in plain sight. I knew my greedy status-obsessed sister Olivia could not resist snooping through my private workspace, especially after I had humiliated her in the grand foyer earlier that morning. The bait was successfully taken, and the thick manila folder was gone. I walked over to my security monitors and pulled up the hidden camera footage. I watched the playback of Olivia sneaking into my office like a common thief, her eyes widening with greedy delight as she read the vasectomy report. Instead of acting like a loyal, dedicated family member and running straight to tell her precious mother-in-law, Beatrice, the truth, Olivia saw a golden opportunity for her own selfish financial gain. She tucked the folder into her designer bag and rushed out of the room with a wicked smile on her face. Later that afternoon, I tracked Olivia's location to a highly secluded VIP dining room at the elite country club. She had urgently demanded a private emergency meeting with Xavier. I parked my car in the shaded back lot and sat quietly in the driver's seat, listening to the crystal-clear audio feed transmitting directly to my encrypted tablet. I had slipped a tiny micro receiver into the inner lining of Olivia's beige cashmere coat when she had grabbed my arm in the foyer hours earlier. Olivia's voice echoed through my earpiece, dripping with venomous delight and arrogant power. I listened as she slapped the stolen medical file onto the expensive dining table right in front of Xavier. She told him she knew his new pregnant bride was a complete fraud, and that his elite generational heir was an absolute physical impossibility. Xavier panicked immediately, his voice cracking as he begged her to keep her voice down and hide the paperwork. He sounded like a terrified little boy, realizing his entire fake life was about to be burned to the ground by his own mother. Olivia laughed a cold, sharp laugh and told him she would not say a single word to Beatrice on one very specific and highly expensive condition. She demanded that Xavier wire $10 million in untraceable investment capital directly to Spencer by the end of the week. She told him that Spencer was about to lose his banking license and face federal prison because of the massive liquidity crisis my father had triggered. She squeezed Xavier relentlessly, making him promise to steal the funds from his new father-in-law's accounts, just to keep his shameful secret hidden from the wrath of Beatrice. Xavier was completely broken, and agreed to her extortion, practically sobbing as he rushed out of the country club to figure out how to steal the money. About 20 minutes later, Olivia marched straight out to the parking lot and yanked open the passenger door of my car. She threw herself onto the leather seat, crossing her legs and glaring at me with a triumphant, wicked smile. She told me she knew I was the one who dug up the medical records, and she demanded that I back off and stay out of her way completely. She sneered and said I was always too weak and too sentimental to play the real game of wealth and power. She bragged loudly that she was going to use my hard work to blackmail Xavier and completely fund Spencer's failing banking empire. She leaned close to my face, smelling of expensive champagne and bitter, desperate greed. She declared that with this massive extortion, money, she was going to become the new undisputed queen of Atlanta high society. She told me I would always be a pathetic working-class loser trapped at the very bottom of the social ladder while she ruled the elite circles with an iron fist. She said she was finally going to get the respect and the unshakable power she deserved, and that I was going to sit quietly and watch her ascend to the throne. She actually believed she had outsmarted me and conquered the entire Hawthorne family hierarchy with one stolen document. She thought her little blackmail scheme was a stroke of absolute genius that would secure her future forever. I sat behind the steering wheel, gripping the leather tightly and staring at my deeply delusional sister. I did not raise my voice or show a single trace of anger or intimidation. I just reached over to the center console and tapped the glowing screen of my encrypted tablet. I told Olivia she was right about one thing. I told her the medical records were the ultimate leverage, but she had severely miscalculated who was actually holding the real power in this city. I smiled a cold, empty smile and told her she should look down and check her phone. Her confident, arrogant smirk vanished instantly as her screen lit up with an urgent incoming call from Beatrice. What Olivia did not know was that I had not just been recording her little blackmail session with Xavier. I had bypassed the recording feature entirely and set up a live audio stream. I had patched the live feed from the microphone in her coat pocket directly into a continuous open phone call with Beatrice. I looked at Olivia as the color completely drained from her face and told her that Beatrice had just listened to every single word of her extortion plot, and she was waiting for an explanation. The silence in the car was absolute as the reality of her ruined scheme crashed down on Olivia. I watched the arrogant smirk completely melt off her face, replaced by a pale mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. She stared at the phone screen in my hand as Beatrice's heavy breathing transmitted through the open audio channel. I calmly reached across the console, unlocked the passenger door, and told my sister to get out of my vehicle. Olivia scrambled out of the leather seat, stumbling over her expensive high heels, and practically fell onto the hot asphalt of the parking lot. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled away, leaving her standing alone in the brutal afternoon sun, knowing her precious high society life was about to be violently dismantled. I parked a few rows away, wanting to witness the spectacular implosion of their fragile alliance. I walked back toward the grand entrance of the elite country club, slipping quietly through the heavy brass doors. The main dining room was a picture of Southern extravagance, filled with wealthy patrons sipping champagne and discussing their stock portfolios under massive crystal chandeliers. But the polite murmurs were abruptly shattered by the sound of breaking porcelain. Beatrice had not just listened to the phone call, she had been having lunch in the private garden room just down the hall from where Xavier and Olivia had held their secret meeting. Beatrice marched into the center of the main dining room, looking like a vengeful force of nature. Her designer silk dress swished aggressively as she cornered Olivia and Xavier near the lavish dessert buffet. Beatrice did not care about maintaining the polite illusion of high society etiquette anymore. She raised her voice so every single wealthy investor and gossiping socialite in the room could hear her crystal clear. She screamed at Xavier, calling him a pathetic weakling for letting a common gold digger blackmail him. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to hide a permanent vasectomy while letting his new fraudulent bride parade around claiming to carry the elite family heir. Xavier shrank back against the dessert table, looking like a terrified child incapable of defending himself against his mother's blinding wrath. Beatrice then turned her vicious gaze entirely onto Olivia. She told my sister she was nothing but a cheap parasitic rat trying to extort $10 million from a family that had already given her too much. Beatrice announced to the entire silent room that Olivia and her banking husband were completely broke and desperate to cover up their own massive financial crimes. The wealthy patrons stopped eating their expensive meals and openly stared at the spectacle. Olivia was trembling, her face bright red with supreme humiliation as the elite circle she worshipped finally saw her as a desperate fraud. Just as Olivia opened her mouth to stutter out a pathetic apology, Spencer pushed his way through the gathering crowd. He had rushed to the country club after I destroyed his banking career, hoping to finalize the blackmail money and save himself from federal prison. Spencer stepped in front of Olivia, trying to puff out his chest and project the unearned authority he always used to intimidate people. His face was slick with nervous sweat, and his tailored suit looked rumpled and pathetic. He pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice and demanded that she lower her voice and show his wife some respect. He arrogantly told Beatrice that she needed him to manage her failing offshore accounts and that she was in no position to insult his family. Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She looked Spencer up and down with absolute icy disgust and told him he was a complete failure who had just single-handedly bankrupted his own branch. She informed him that he had no power, no leverage, and no future in her world. Spencer completely lost his temper as his fragile ego shattered under the weight of her absolute rejection. The desperate panic of facing federal prison mixed with his deep-seated arrogance, and he lashed out blindly. He took a step toward Beatrice and told her she should be grateful he even associated with her family. He spat out that without his banking connections, she would just be another loud, obnoxious black woman pretending to belong in a world built by people who looked like him. The entire country club went dead silent. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing. Every single patron stared in absolute shock at the sheer, blatant racism of his desperate attack. Spencer realized the magnitude of his mistake the second the words left his mouth, but the damage was permanently done. Beatrice did not flinch or back down. She stood taller, looking at Spencer with a deadly calm that was far more terrifying than her previous screaming. She told him he had just signed his own death warrant. She announced with absolute finality that she was firing his investment firm on the spot. She declared she was pulling every single dime of her family money out of his control and launching a full forensic audit into every transaction he had ever made on their behalf. She promised him that by the time her lawyers were finished, he would be rotting in a federal prison cell for the rest of his miserable life. Beatrice turned her back on him, completely dismissing his existence, and marched out of the country club with her head held high. The elite crowd immediately turned their backs on Spencer and Olivia, treating them like highly infectious diseases. The social execution was absolute and instantaneous. Spencer stood frozen in the middle of the room as the reality of his total destruction set in. He had no banking job, no offshore accounts to hide behind, and absolutely no blackmail money to cover the massive $50 million deficit he had caused. He grabbed Olivia by the arm and dragged her roughly out the side exit, ignoring her sobbing protests. I watched them flee to their car, knowing exactly what was happening in Spencer's frantic mind. He was completely cornered and terrified of spending his life behind bars. He knew Xavier's family still had one final operational emergency account containing exactly $5 million in liquid cash. Spencer realized he could no longer save his career or his marriage. He made a dark, desperate decision right there in the parking lot. He decided he was going to drain that final $5 million account, abandon Olivia completely, and flee the country before the federal investigators could freeze his passport. I watched the digital tracking algorithms on my secure tablet as Spencer executed his cowardly exit strategy. He had logged into the Hawthorne family banking portal using his executive credentials and bypassed all the standard security protocols. Within a matter of seconds, he drained the final $5 million in liquid cash, transferring the funds through a highly complex maze of untraceable offshore cryptocurrency accounts. He did not even bother going back to his house to pack a bag or check on Olivia. The airport security cameras showed him boarding a private charter flight to a country with no extradition treaty, leaving his wife and his entire career burning in the wreckage behind him. By the time Beatrice returned to the sprawling Hawthorne generational estate, she was walking into a complete and absolute financial apocalypse. She opened the heavy mahogany front doors, expecting to find her staff preparing dinner, but the massive house was completely silent. Xavier was sitting on the bottom step of the grand staircase, with his head buried in his hands, looking utterly defeated and broken. His new bride, the supposedly untouchable real estate heiress, had already packed her designer luggage and fled the property the second she realized the accounts were empty and her scam was officially over. Xavier looked up at his mother with tears streaming down his face and finally confessed the entire pathetic truth. He admitted the pregnancy was a complete lie, that the bride was bankrupt, and that he had gotten a permanent vasectomy 3 years ago. Beatrice stood frozen in her magnificent marble foyer as the heavy reality of her absolute destruction finally crushed the breath out of her lungs. Every single pillar of her elite dynasty had completely evaporated in a single afternoon. The massive federal banking loans were defaulting. The fake real estate merger was officially dead. Her son was a public laughingstock, and Spencer had stolen their absolute last lifeline before vanishing into thin air. The federal bank investigators were already drafting the aggressive foreclosure papers for the Hawthorne estate. Beatrice had less than 24 hours before the banks seized the historic property and threw her out onto the street with absolutely nothing to her name. In her absolute frantic desperation, Beatrice turned to the only corporate entity left in the entire financial sector with enough liquid capital to save her from federal ruin. She locked herself inside her dark private study and dialed the emergency executive contact number for the Apex Heritage Fund. She had absolutely no idea that I was the chief executive officer sitting in the shadows, controlling the very fund she was desperately begging for salvation. I sat in my command center watching her incoming call blink rapidly on my secure dashboard. I signaled my senior acquisitions director Marcus to answer the encrypted line while I listened to the entire conversation in complete absolute silence. Beatrice did not sound anything like the arrogant high society matriarch who had spent years treating me like worthless working-class dirt. Her voice trembled with pure, unadulterated terror as she pleaded with Marcus for an immediate $50 million liquidity bridge. She tried to maintain a tiny shred of her elite pride, offering a long list of worthless collateral and making empty promises about future stock dividends and upcoming real estate developments. Marcus followed my specific instructions perfectly. He cut right through her desperate rambling with a cold, calculated professional tone that offered zero sympathy. He systematically dismantled every single lie she tried to spin. He informed Beatrice that Apex Heritage was fully aware of the Hawthorne family financial collapse and that their standard corporate assets were currently classified as completely worthless toxic junk. He told her we knew about the empty offshore accounts, the federal investigations, and the fact that her former banking manager had just fled the country with her remaining cash. I listened to Beatrice begin to softly cry over the secure line, her heavy sobs echoing through my earpiece as she begged Marcus to find some kind of arrangement to save her historic legacy. Marcus paused for a long, agonizing moment, letting the heavy silence amplify her absolute panic and humiliate her even further. He then delivered the final crushing condition exactly as I had written it on his monitor. He told Beatrice that Apex Heritage would clear the massive federal debt and stop the immediate bank foreclosure under one very specific non-negotiable term. She had to surrender the original historic deed to the Hawthorne generational estate. She had to sign over complete and total ownership of the massive property, the elite family name, and the only thing she actually loved in this entire world. Beatrice gasped as if she had been physically struck. She sobbed into the phone, pleading that the estate had been in her family for generations and that it was the very foundation of her identity. She begged Marcus to take anything else, but he remained completely silent, letting her drown in the realization that she had absolutely no other choice. If she refused, the federal authorities would seize the house by morning, and she would likely face federal prison time for the fraudulent loans Spencer had secured in her name. With her elite identity shattering into a million pieces, Beatrice weakly agreed to surrender the property just to save herself from complete annihilation. Marcus did not offer a single ounce of comfort or relief as she cried. He simply read the final instruction I had highlighted on his screen. He told her the digital paperwork was already authorized and legally binding. Then he delivered the final devastating blow stating our CEO requires you and your family to be at the estate at 8 a.m. tomorrow for the handover. The morning fog was still clinging to the perfectly manicured lawns of the Hawthorne estate when Elijah and I drove through the massive wrought iron gates. The sprawling ancestral home stood like a giant stone monument to a dying dynasty. I parked my car a discreet distance away from the grand entrance, and we walked up the wide marble steps together. The heavy mahogany doors were unlocked, and the sheer silence echoing from inside the mansion was absolutely deafening. We stepped into the breathtaking grand foyer and found the remnants of high society standing around like ghosts trapped in their own personal purgatory. It was exactly 8 in the morning, and the tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Beatrice was standing near the sweeping spiral staircase looking completely hollowed out. She was wearing her finest black mourning dress, perhaps as a dramatic symbol of her dying legacy, but her posture lacked its usual terrifying authority. Her hands were shaking as she clutched a leather folder containing the historic property deeds. Xavier was pacing back and forth across the checkered marble floor, chewing on his fingernails and muttering under his breath. He looked like a cornered animal waiting for the executioner to arrive. Sitting on a velvet bench near the door was his fake pregnant bride. She was clutching her designer handbag to her chest, looking frantically toward the exits as if she was trying to calculate the fastest escape route. She knew her entire scam was over, and she was just waiting for the final curtain to drop on her pathetic performance. Standing entirely alone in the far corner was my sister Olivia. She looked absolutely destroyed. Her face was puffy and red from crying all night after Spencer drained the last remaining emergency account and abandoned her to face the federal investigators alone. She did not have her usual smug, arrogant posture. She just looked like a miserable, broken woman who had finally played a game she could not win. When Elijah and I walked further into the center of the foyer, the entire family stopped and turned their collective rage toward us. They were backed into a corner, losing everything they owned, but they still desperately clung to their pathetic class superiority. Xavier stopped pacing and glared at us with pure, unadulterated disgust. He scoffed loudly and asked if the beggars had come to watch rich people negotiate their assets. He told Elijah and me that we had absolutely no business being inside their ancestral home during a highly confidential corporate handover. He sneered and told us we were probably just there to scavenge whatever scraps were left behind. He bragged that even though they were handing over the estate, they were still elite, and we would always be nobodies. He insisted that the new owners would probably offer them a lucrative board position once the dust settled because billionaires respect historical pedigree. He was so deeply delusional that he actually believed he still had bargaining power. Beatrice stepped forward, pulling her shoulders back and trying to summon the last tiny fraction of her intimidating matriarchal power. She ordered us to leave the property immediately before the executive representatives arrived. She said this was a private financial transition meeting, and common working-class trash were not allowed to witness the transaction. She commanded the room, demanding that we hide in the servant corridors so we would not offend the eyes of their new corporate master. She actually tried to wave us away with her hand like we were stray dogs. I just crossed my arms and stared at her, watching the beads of nervous sweat forming on her forehead. Olivia wiped her red eyes and marched over to me, pointing an angry, trembling finger at my face. She blamed me for absolutely everything that had happened to her. She shrieked that it was my fault Spencer fled the country and left her penniless, because I was the one who exposed the fake pregnancy and the bank fraud. She told me I was a jealous, vindictive little girl who just wanted to ruin her beautiful high society life. She demanded that I get out of her sight before the new owners arrived because my cheap clothes and pathetic presence were a massive insult to the historic estate. Elijah stood perfectly still beside me, radiating a calm, protective energy, while they threw their desperate insults at us. I did not blink or show a single ounce of emotion. I just stood in the center of their grand foyer, checking my watch and waiting for the final piece of my plan to fall into place. A low, powerful humming sound broke through the heavy tension in the room. A massive custom black limousine slowly pulled up the long circular driveway, crushing the gravel beneath its heavy tires. The vehicle stopped directly in front of the grand entrance, blocking the morning sunlight. The entire Hawthorne family immediately panicked. Beatrice frantically smoothed down her dress and ordered Xavier to stand up straight. Olivia quickly wiped her ruined makeup and tried to look composed. The fake bride stood up, clutching her bag even tighter. They all stared out the open double doors with absolute terror and anticipation, waiting to meet the ruthless billionaire who now owned their entire existence. A man in a pristine dark suit stepped out of the driver's seat. He walked around the front of the massive vehicle and opened the rear passenger door with crisp, professional precision. Beatrice held her breath, and Xavier took a step forward, ready to grovel and beg for mercy. They waited for the terrifying corporate titan to step out of the shadows of the back seat. The seconds ticked by in agonizing slow motion. The door remained wide open, but absolutely no one stepped out of the vehicle. The back seat of the luxurious limousine was completely empty. Beatrice frowned in deep confusion, looking from the empty car to the driver. Xavier asked out loud where the chief executive officer was and why the car was empty. The driver did not answer them. He did not even look at the desperate Hawthorne family. He walked straight through the grand mahogany doors, past Beatrice, past Xavier, and past my bewildered sister. He walked directly to the center of the foyer and stopped right in front of me. He gave a deep, respectful bow and handed me a thick leather portfolio containing the finalized transfer documents. He looked me directly in the eyes and addressed me as Madam CEO. The entire room stopped breathing. The utter silence was broken only by the sound of me opening the folder to stamp the final approval. I looked up at Beatrice and watched her entire world shatter as she finally realized the ruthless billionaire who now owned her house, her legacy, and her life was already standing right in front of her. The echo of my final command hung in the dead silence of the grand foyer. Beatrice stared at me with her mouth trembling, unable to comprehend that she was now a trespasser in her own ancestral home. Before anyone could react to my absolute takeover, the heavy mahogany front doors suddenly slammed open with a violent crash. Spencer stumbled into the massive room, completely destroying the quiet tension. He looked absolutely deranged and nothing like the polished, arrogant banking executive he pretended to be. His expensive tailored suit was torn and soaked with nervous sweat. His eyes were wide and manic as he panted heavily, looking around the foyer like a hunted animal. He had clearly realized his escape plan had failed, and he came rushing back to the estate in a state of pure panic. Spencer locked his frantic gaze onto the thick leather portfolio I was holding in my hands. His twisted mind immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion. He screamed that I was holding the forensic audit files containing the direct evidence of his $5 million theft. He yelled that I had sabotaged his offshore transfers and that he was not going to let a pathetic commoner send him to federal prison. Without a single ounce of rational thought, Spencer lunged across the marble floor directly toward me. He reached out with shaking hands violently, trying to snatch the portfolio from my grasp, thinking he could just tear up the documents and magically erase his massive financial crimes. He never even made it within arm's reach of me. Elijah moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. He stepped smoothly in front of me, intercepting Spencer with a brutal physical tackle. The impact sent both men crashing onto the hard, checkered marble floor, but Elijah was entirely in control. He effortlessly flipped Spencer onto his stomach and pinned his arms behind his back, pressing a heavy knee into his spine. Spencer thrashed and screamed, cursing at us and kicking his expensive shoes against the floor like a petulant toddler throwing a temper tantrum. Elijah did not even break a sweat as he held the disgraced banker firmly against the cold stone. While holding Spencer down, Elijah calmly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a single button and gave a brief nod. Almost immediately, the distant sound of approaching sirens pierced the quiet morning air. The wailing grew louder and louder until a dozen police cruisers and federal black vehicles swarmed the circular driveway. The flashing red and blue emergency lights pierced through the ground floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the terrified faces of the Hawthorne family. The federal authorities had completely surrounded the estate, cutting off any possible escape route. Beatrice and Xavier shrank back against the staircase, watching their former banking manager weep on the floor. Spencer stopped thrashing and stared at the flashing lights in absolute horror. He began to hyperventilate, begging to know how the police had found him so fast. Elijah leaned down and delivered a revelation that completely shattered Spencer and his remaining sanity. Elijah calmly explained that Spencer was not nearly as smart as he believed he was. He told the pathetic banker that those untraceable offshore cryptocurrency accounts he used to hide the stolen $5 million were not actually anonymous at all. Elijah revealed that he had recently purchased a controlling majority stake in the exact shadow banking network Spencer used to launder his dirty money. Elijah explained that he had personally watched Spencer log into the system and execute the illegal wire transfer in real time. The moment the stolen funds hit the offshore ledger, Elijah initiated a permanent hard freeze on the entire network, trapping the $5 million in an impenetrable digital vault. He then packaged the entire clean transaction history, including Spencer and his exact internet addresses and login credentials, and handed it directly to the federal investigators. Elijah looked down at the sobbing man and told him he had nowhere to run and absolutely no money to pay for a defense attorney. The heavy footsteps of armed federal agents echoed up the marble steps of the estate. They marched through the open doors, holding heavy metal handcuffs and official federal arrest warrants. Spencer realized his luxurious life was officially over and that he was about to spend the rest of his miserable existence rotting in a federal penitentiary. In a final act of pathetic desperation, he twisted his head and looked across the foyer at Olivia. He screamed for his wife to help him. He begged Olivia to call her family lawyers and use her high society connections to get the charges dropped. He cried out that he only stole the money to maintain their lavish lifestyle and that she had to vouch for him to the authorities. Olivia looked down at the pathetic crying man pinned to her former floor. She had just lost her entire fortune, her social standing, and her ancestral home in the span of a single morning. She was completely humiliated and had absolutely no use for a bankrupt criminal husband who had just accelerated her total destruction. She knew associating with Spencer would only drag her down into the federal fraud investigation. She straightened her posture, pulling her shoulders back in a desperate attempt to salvage her own dignity. She looked at Spencer with an expression of pure, icy disgust. She told the federal agents marching through the front doors that she had absolutely no idea who this man was. Olivia completely turned her back on her sobbing husband and loudly announced that she did not know this white-collar criminal. The federal agents moved in quickly, grabbing Spencer by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. They read him his rights as they locked the heavy steel cuffs around his wrists. Spencer continued to sob and beg, looking back at Beatrice and Xavier for any shred of support, but they both turned their faces away, terrified of being implicated in his massive banking fraud. They watched the agents drag the disgraced executive out the front doors and shove him into the back of a waiting federal cruiser. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the utter despair radiating from the remaining family members. My absolute total victory was completely undeniable as I stood in the center of my new grand foyer, watching the people who had tormented me lose absolutely everything they had ever valued. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded down the long circular driveway, leaving the grand foyer of the Hawthorne estate drowning in a heavy, suffocating silence. Beatrice and Xavier were completely paralyzed, standing frozen near the grand staircase, like decorative statues who had just witnessed their own funeral. They were still reeling from the devastating reality. that they had exactly 30 minutes to pack their bags and vacate my property. Olivia watched the federal vehicles disappear, carrying her disgraced husband off to federal prison before she slowly turned her head to look at me. The arrogant superiority that had defined her entire existence completely vanished from her face. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she was now entirely alone and completely penniless. The cruel older sister who had spent my entire life treating me like an embarrassing burden suddenly dropped to her knees on the cold marble floor. Olivia scrambled across the checkered tiles, completely ignoring the fact that her expensive designer dress was getting ruined by the dust. She threw herself at my feet and frantically grabbed the hem of my coat, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Huge, dramatic tears began streaming down her face as she launched into the most pathetic, desperate apology I had ever heard in my entire life. She sobbed heavily, claiming that she was completely innocent and that she had been trapped in a toxic, abusive marriage. Olivia pointed her trembling finger toward the front doors and blamed absolutely everything on Spencer. She shrieked that her husband was a manipulative monster who had forced her to go along with his horrible financial crimes and his vicious attacks against me. She wept and swore that she had always loved me and that Spencer had poisoned her mind against her own flesh and blood. She begged me to forgive her, claiming she was just an innocent victim of his white-collar greed and that she never wanted to see me get hurt. I stood completely still and stared down at the miserable woman groveling at my feet. Elijah stepped up right beside me, radiating a calm, protective energy, but he let me handle my treacherous sister entirely on my own. Olivia reached out and desperately tried to grab my hands, but I took a cold, deliberate step backward, forcing her to fall flat on her hands and knees. Olivia looked up at me with absolute sheer panic and started begging for a place to live. She completely abandoned whatever tiny shred of dignity she had left and pleaded to move into the sprawling estate with me. She called me her sweet, beautiful little sister and promised she would be the most loyal, supportive family member in the world if I just let her stay in one of the empty luxury guest wings. She babbled hysterically about how we could decorate the mansion together and host fabulous high society parties now that the toxic people were finally out of our lives. She actually tried to smile through her heavy tears, attempting to use the fake sisterly charm she had always used to manipulate people into getting her way. She promised to be my best friend and my closest confidant, as long as she did not have to face the terrifying reality of the outside world. I looked down at the pathetic, grasping woman at my feet and felt a wave of pure, absolute disgust. I reached deep into my coat pocket and wrapped my fingers around an object I had kept with me for months, waiting for this exact, perfect moment. I pulled out the cheap, sparkling fake tiara that Olivia had violently snatched from my head at the altar on the day she tried to ruin my wedding. I looked at the tacky plastic rhinestones glinting in the morning light before I tossed the worthless object onto the hard marble floor. The fake crown clattered loudly against the stone, echoing through the dead silence of the massive foyer, before it rolled directly into her trembling hands. Olivia stared down at the cheap plastic tiara in absolute total confusion. I looked her dead in the eyes, and my voice was cold and completely empty of any mercy. I told her that she had spent her entire miserable life worshipping a fragile illusion of wealth and elite status. I reminded her that she loved pretending to be high society royalty so much that she was willing to destroy her own sister just to wear a pathetic crown. I told her she could keep the fake tiara because it was the only piece of legacy she would ever possess again. I instructed her to take her precious fake crown with her when she packed up her designer bags and walked out the door. Olivia opened her mouth to argue, to beg for just one more chance, but I immediately cut her off and delivered the final crushing blow. I leaned down slightly and looked straight into her terrified eyes. I informed her that she would need to find a very cheap place to sleep tonight because she no longer had a home to return to. I told her that our father had officially reviewed the massive mountain of evidence detailing her endless lies, her cruel betrayals, and her direct complicity in the bank fraud. I explained that our father was so utterly disgusted by her actions that he had permanently cut off all funding for her luxury downtown penthouse apartment this very morning. I watched the last spark of hope completely die behind her eyes as the devastating truth crashed down on her. I told her the locks on the penthouse had already been changed and her credit cards were entirely canceled by the bank. She had absolutely nothing left to her name except the clothes on her back and the cheap plastic tiara resting on the floor. I stood up tall and ordered her to get off my marble floor and get off my property before I had the estate security physically throw her out into the street like the absolute garbage she was. Olivia remained completely frozen, staring blindly at the fake crown as the reality of her total unmitigated destruction finally set in. The absolute silence in the grand foyer was suddenly broken by a pathetic whimpering sound that seemed to echo off the high vaulted ceilings. Xavier had been standing completely paralyzed near the bottom of the grand wooden staircase, watching his family get systematically dismantled right in front of his eyes. The terrifying reality of his own catastrophic mistakes finally broke through the thick layer of arrogant delusion he had worn his entire life. He slowly sank to his knees on the cold checkered marble floor, his incredibly expensive tailored wedding suit pooling awkwardly around him. Heavy tears began streaming down his perfectly groomed face as he looked up at me with an expression of pure, desperate terror. He began to crawl forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his upper-class dignity. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grasp the hem of my coat, but he was too afraid to actually touch me. He begged for just one more chance, his voice cracking and pitching in a high, desperate tone. He sobbed uncontrollably, telling me that he had been incredibly blind and profoundly stupid, and that his overbearing mother had forced him into making all of those terrible decisions. He actually had the absolute audacity to blame Beatrice for his own pathetic weakness. He promised he would do absolutely anything to win my love back, and that we could rule this incredible financial empire together as husband and wife. He cried out that he loved me, and that he had always loved me even when he was actively betraying me with a hired fraud. He said we could forget the past year ever happened and just go back to the way things were when we were happy. The hired bride, who had been standing frozen out on the front porch watching the federal agents drag Spencer away, finally processed the reality of her situation. She realized with absolute certainty that there was absolutely zero money left in the Hawthorne bank accounts and that her lucrative fake marriage contract was now completely worthless. The promise of a luxurious high society lifestyle had just evaporated into thin air. She turned around and marched right back into the massive foyer, her designer high heels clicking aggressively against the polished stone floor. She walked directly up to the groveling Xavier, who was still weeping loudly at my feet. She did not yell or scream or ask for any explanations because she already knew she had been completely scammed by a family of bankrupt liars. Without saying a single word, she raised her arm and slapped Xavier across the face with such intense, vicious force that the sharp crack echoed loudly through the entire house. The impact threw Xavier completely off balance, sending him collapsing sideways onto the hard floor, where he curled up, clutching his bright red, stinging cheek in absolute shock. The fake wife did not even look down at him again. She simply turned around and stormed right back out the open front doors, walking fiercely down the long, winding driveway and disappearing from their ruined lives forever. Beatrice watched the entire humiliating spectacle unfold from her spot pinned against the wall. She saw her precious golden son sobbing on the floor after being physically struck by a hired imposter. She saw her favorite daughter clutching a cheap plastic tiara, completely stripped of her massive wealth and elite social status. She looked at me standing tall and untouchable in the absolute center of the incredible home she used to rule with an iron fist. The sheer, undeniable magnitude of her utter failure crashed down upon her all at once, crushing the breath right out of her lungs. Her face went completely pale, and her eyes rolled back into her head as her knees completely gave out beneath her. Beatrice collapsed into a pathetic heap on the marble floor, fainting dead away from the profound psychological shock of losing absolutely everything she had ever valued in her entire arrogant life. I did not feel a single drop of pity as I looked down at the ruined family scattered helplessly across my beautiful floor. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settling deep inside my chest. I gave a brief silent nod to Elijah, who immediately radioed my private security team waiting outside on the manicured lawn. A dozen massive men wearing dark tailored suits stepped into the grand foyer, moving with terrifying military precision. Half of them marched straight up the grand staircase, their heavy boots thudding against the wood as they headed directly for the luxurious master suite. Within minutes, they returned carrying massive armfuls of Beatrice and Olivia's ridiculously expensive designer luggage. They carried the heavy leather vintage trunks and custom monogrammed garment bags right past the sobbing Xavier and the unconscious Beatrice without a single ounce of hesitation. The security team marched straight out the front doors and walked down the long driveway to the very edge of the sprawling property. They did not gently place the luxury luggage on the ground. They violently hurled the incredibly expensive bags right over the towering iron gates, tossing them directly out onto the dirty public street. Delicate designer dresses and wildly expensive imported shoes spilled out onto the rough pavement, completely exposed to the harsh elements and the staring, judging eyes of the passing wealthy neighbors. I stood on the top step of the grand porch, watching the expensive luggage hit the asphalt, and I perfectly remembered the terrible day they had done the exact same thing to me. I remembered standing on that very street, holding a single cheap plastic trash bag containing all my worldly belongings, while Beatrice and Xavier cruelly laughed at my pain from this exact same porch. The poetic justice of this moment was overwhelmingly sweet and entirely absolute. My private security guards moved back inside the foyer and grabbed Xavier roughly by the arms, hauling him forcefully to his feet. They forced him to pick up the dead weight of his unconscious mother and dragged them both mercilessly out the front doors. Olivia stumbled out right behind them, her designer dress dragging on the floor as she still clutched her fake tiara with a hollow, dead expression painted across her face. The security team physically pushed all of them past the property line and stood like a solid, impenetrable wall of muscle blocking the driveway. The Hawthorne family was officially and permanently exiled from their own kingdom, standing penniless and totally disgraced on the public street, surrounded by their discarded designer garbage. I stood completely still on the grand marble threshold, letting the cool morning breeze gently wash over my face. I looked out at the pathetic, crying people who had tried to systematically destroy my life and realized they had absolutely no power left in this world. They were nothing but ghosts of a fake legacy that had finally been erased. I did not say another word to them because they were simply no longer worth my breath or my time. I turned on my heel and walked smoothly back into the spectacular foyer of my massive new estate. Behind me, the heavy oak front doors swung shut with a deep resounding thud, echoing the final absolute end of their empty dynasty. The heavy brass lock engaged with a loud metallic click, sealing away the dark past and locking out any possible ounce of pity forever. I walked away from the heavy oak doors, letting the final mechanical click of the brass lock settle deep into my bones. The massive estate was suddenly incredibly peaceful and quiet. The oppressive, suffocating energy that the Hawthorne family had infected this house with for generations was completely gone. I walked slowly across the grand foyer with my head held high, feeling the solid marble floor beneath my feet. This house was no longer a monument to their fake superiority and endless lies. It was a testament to my survival and my ultimate triumph. Elijah walked quietly beside me, his footsteps echoing softly in the vast empty space. We did not need to say a single word to each other, because the profound justice of what we had just accomplished spoke entirely for itself. We walked side by side up the sweeping grand staircase, trailing our hands along the polished mahogany banister. I felt a tremendous weight lifting off my shoulders with every single step we took toward the second floor. We reached the massive master suite at the end of the long hallway, and I pushed open the double doors. The room was flooded with bright natural sunlight pouring in through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked directly across the plush carpet and pushed open the heavy glass French doors that led out onto the sprawling master balcony. The fresh morning air washed over me, carrying the faint scent of the manicured gardens below. I stepped up to the ornate stone railing and placed my hands on the cool marble, looking down at the spectacular view of my new domain. Elijah stepped out onto the balcony right beside me, leaning against the railing, as we both looked past the heavy iron gates at the very edge of the property. The scene unfolding out on the public street was a picture of absolute poetic justice. The flashing police lights that had accompanied Spencer's humiliating arrest had drawn a massive crowd of vultures. Local news vans and aggressive paparazzi had completely swarmed the perimeter of the estate. The reporters had clearly caught wind of the massive federal banking scandal and the total catastrophic bankruptcy of the Hawthorne family. Xavier, Beatrice, and Olivia were completely trapped on the dirty public sidewalk, surrounded by a vicious sea of flashing cameras and shouting journalists. They had absolutely nowhere to run and no private security team left to shield them from the consequences of their own horrible actions. I watched from high above as aggressive reporters shoved heavy microphones directly into their terrified faces, demanding answers about the $5 million federal fraud investigation. Beatrice was desperately trying to hide her face behind her expensive designer handbag, but the relentless photographers circled her like hungry wolves, capturing every single angle of her total humiliation. The woman who had spent her entire life judging people based on their social status was now front-page tabloid fodder, completely disgraced and entirely penniless. Xavier looked like a broken, pathetic shell of a man, constantly looking back at the locked iron gates of my estate, as if he still believed I might magically swoop down and save him from his own self-inflicted misery. He was crying openly while camera flashes illuminated his tear-stained face, permanently recording his absolute downfall for the entire world to see. Olivia was sitting on one of her discarded luxury suitcases on the curb, sobbing hysterically as she clutched that worthless plastic tiara to her chest. She looked entirely unhinged, babbling to anyone who would listen about how she was an innocent victim, while the reporters ruthlessly questioned her about her complicit involvement in her husband's offshore money laundering scheme. I stood on my balcony and watched the chaotic circus below, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of closure. They were finally experiencing the exact same public humiliation and total devastation they had gleefully inflicted upon me. They were receiving the exact verdict that traitors and liars always eventually receive. Elijah stepped away from the railing for a brief moment and walked back into the master suite. When he returned, he was carrying a polished silver tray holding two elegant crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of incredibly expensive vintage champagne. I turned to look at the man who had been my rock, my mentor, and the only real father I had ever truly known. He popped the cork with a soft, satisfying thud and poured the golden, bubbling liquid into the crystal glasses. The morning sunlight caught the rising bubbles, making them sparkle like liquid gold. Elijah handed me one of the delicate flutes and looked at me with an expression of such deep, profound pride that it brought tears of joy to my eyes. He did not look at me like a business partner or a protege. He looked at me like a daughter who had just conquered the entire world. He raised his glass slightly, and his deep, rich voice was filled with absolute, unwavering conviction. He told me that today I had taught them what real Black excellence is. He looked deeply into my eyes and said that it is not in a last name, it is in what you build with your own two hands. I felt a massive wave of overwhelming love and fierce pride swell in my chest as his powerful words washed over me. I raised my crystal flute and gently clinked it against his. The bright, clear, ringing sound echoed beautifully across the quiet balcony, soaring high above the miserable, chaotic noise of the ruined family suffering down on the street below. I took a slow, sweet sip of the champagne, letting the cool, crisp taste celebrate my ultimate victory. I leaned against the stone railing beside my father, looking out past the estate and toward the endless, bright horizon. The sky above us was a brilliant, vibrant blue, without a single dark cloud in sight. I took a deep, cleansing breath and smiled, feeling completely and entirely free. The dark shadows of the past were permanently erased, leaving me standing in the warm, beautiful sunlight of a brilliant, independent, and fiercely powerful new life. The greatest lesson from this entire ordeal is that true worth is never determined by the family you were born into or the toxic expectations they force upon you. Real legacy is not an inherited last name or a fake crown. It is the strength, resilience, and unshakable empire you build with your own two hands when everyone else has abandoned you. Walking away from toxic people is not a failure. It is the ultimate victory. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace and build your own success? Share your personal journey in the comments below, and please like and subscribe for more empowering stories about taking back your power.